Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Heidi Lewis, and I am Director and Associate Professor of Feminist and Gender Studies at Colorado College, as well as Inaugural Coordinator of Early Career Faculty Development Programs. And we are here, as you know, to kick off the Action Words series event focused on the play By the Way, Vera Stark. The Action Word series is a Fine Arts Center Connect program devoted to conversation and literary arts that respond to social issues and collective conversation, with engagements ranging from spoken word poetry performance to play readings, panel discussions, and more. In today's event, I'll be joined by students in my Feminist Theory course here at Colorado College to discuss By the Way, Meet Vera Starks, a play by Pulitzer Prize winning playwright Lynn Nottage, on stage at the Fine Arts Center through March 20th, and featuring so many brilliant actors, including Lynette Freeman, Dana Skurlock, Marissa Herbert, and Rebecca Myers. Um, so essentially what we're going to do is I'm going to invite several of my students on stage to talk about the course, what we're doing in the course, what the course is intended to accomplish. I'm going to have some of them talk about the heterogeneity of feminist theory, meaning the complex ways that we understand what the work of feminist theory is and what it aims to do. We're going to dive into a more particular discussion about Black feminist theory, including a conversation about one of the key concepts that comes out of Black feminist theory known as intersectionality. And then I'm going to have a couple of my students join me in order to have some discussion around the play, particularly focused on the ways that Black feminist theory could yield various interpretations of the play, as well as the ways that other interpretations are influenced by other kinds of frameworks. So that being said, I'm going to invite one of my students onto the stage with me to discuss the course. So before we get into that, Feminist Theory is a 200 level course that's sort of situated as the second in a series of courses that allow students to pursue either a major or minor in feminist and gender studies. And in this course, we survey and historicize feminist theories, including but not limited to Black feminism, transnational feminism, Chicana feminism, Marxist feminism, trans feminism, eco-feminism, and several others, in order to encourage students to understand feminist theory as a multivocal intellectual project grounded in shifting geopolitical conjunctures. By the end of the course, students are able to learn the importance of the following objectives, as well as the skills required to perform them at an intermediate or 200 level. So they study the ways feminist theories interrogate the impetuses for and implications of power and dominance that result in myriad forms of oppression, whether we're talking about racism, sexism, homophobia, and others. They examine feminist politics that aim to eradicate oppression at best, address them at least. They learn to pay careful attention to the relationships between time, geography, feminist theorizing, and the development of feminist politics. And they learn to converse with multivocal and multidirectional feminist theory in all of their coursework. Further, by the end of the course, students learn the importance of the following outcomes, as well as the skills required to perform them at an intermediate or 200 level, such as describing how historical and geopolitical context, as well as positionality, have informed some definitions of feminist theory. They learn to discuss the work of theory with the purpose of explaining some relationships between feminist theory and feminist politics. And they learn to elaborate on the heterogeneity of feminist theory with the ability to provide examples of some relevant key debates within the field. With that said, I'm going to invite one of my students, L Triplet, on the stage to talk a little bit more about what do we mean when we talk about the heterogeneity of feminist theory. Hi, L. Why don't you start by introducing yourself to the people?
Hi, yeah, my name is L Triplet. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm a sophomore at CC, and I am a computer science and feminism and gender studies double major. So as Dr. Lewis mentioned, in this class we cover a lot of different feminist theories. Although most feminists agree that structures of power have historically and to this day oppressed women, and that these systems of power must be interrogated and eliminated, They all differ significantly in their beliefs of how these systems came to be and how best to defeat them. While there is disagreement and discourse within each school of feminist thought, as well as between the different schools, these categories are still useful to help understand different perspectives on feminism. While it would take much more time than we have today to address all of the feminist frameworks in detail, I'm going to explain a few now just to demonstrate the heterogeneity of feminist thinking. The first framework I'll talk about is one you may have heard of, radical feminism. A core tenet of radical feminism is the belief that true gender equality is impossible under the current system of patriarchy, and thus that a restructuring of society is needed to eliminate male supremacy. From there, radical feminists can be separated into two main camps, the radical cultural feminists and radical libertarian feminists. Radical cultural feminists critique androgyny and advocate for women to embrace their femininity. Many of them also advocate for political lesbianism to separate more fully from men. Radical libertarian feminists, on the other hand, advocate for women to be more masculine or androgynous, and some just believe that gender should be eliminated altogether. Some critiques of radical feminism as a whole are that it tends to put women on a pedestal and that it creates too many false dichotomies. In response to the criticism that feminism was too white, many different women of color groups began to develop their own feminist theories. We're going to talk about Black feminism a little bit later, but another significant woman of color feminism is Chicana feminism, Chicana being a term for Mexican American women. Chicana feminism came from critiques of gender inequality in the Chicano rights movement. It's very concerned with cross-cultural dialogue and with issues that specifically impact Chicanas like healthcare and childcare. Chicana feminists also often value a rejection of binary thinking in favor of multiple ways of understanding the world. While they, like radical feminists, see sexism as a problem for women, they also include other systems of oppression like race and class discrimination in their theorizing. A third feminist framework I'll talk about very quickly is Eco-Feminism. While there are many branches of Eco-Feminism, there are some core characteristics that all Eco-Feminists share. One of these is the idea that the treatment of women and nature is inherently linked, and that understanding the treatment of one can help understand the treatment of another. Another core eco-feminist theory is that man's domination over nature is a problem that needs to be stopped. Ecofeminism is sometimes critiqued for being too essentialist in the ways that it connects women with nature, and for not always attending carefully to issues of race and class. While there are many, many more feminist frameworks than I've had time to mention, hopefully what I talked about helped you understand the wide range of feminist thought and the incredible differences between these frameworks. It's important to keep in mind, however, that no matter how much feminist thinkers differ, they all agree that women do face oppression in society that needs to be addressed and stopped.
Thank you so much, Elle. I really appreciate it. And now we're going to have another one of my students, Lucia, come on the stage and talk a little bit about what we've been up to in the course. Hi, Lucia.
Hi, everybody.
Hi. So I was able to give the audience some insight into the course description and some of our objectives and learning outcomes. But if you don't mind, it would be great, I think, if you could talk about your experiences engaging with all the different kinds of feminist theories and politics that Elle just talked about, and what kinds of activities we've been doing in the course to help you and your peers, your classmates, make more sense of the heterogeneity of feminist theory.
Yeah, of course. So we do a lot of dialogues within the class about readings that we do twice a week. And then another thing that we get to do with the readings is discussion boards on Canvas. So that's online discussion boards that we do twice a week with classmates. And you also get an opportunity to write an essay about that. So we're really engaging with texts deeply in this class. It hops around a lot throughout history. And so really being able to dive in deeply and engage with those texts is really helpful. Along with that, we get to do a current events essay. So we focus on an event that's happening in the world right now. I focus on the figure skating situation with the Olympics, but a lot of people have focused on a bunch of different issues that are happening right now, and you look at that through feminist frameworks that we've been focusing on in class. And then our last big project is a magazine. So you focus on a feminist framework or more than one feminist framework that we've been working on in class. And with a few other classmates, you put together a magazine. So you have interviewers, editors, a graphic designer, and that's sort of what we're doing to wrap up our class.
Yes, and if anybody is interested, all of the magazines get published on www.femgeniuses.com. But I really want to thank Lucia and Elle for their comments, because I think one of the misconceptions about feminist theorizing and feminist politics is that we all agree on the same things, and we don't. And then when we try to have conversations about what we may differ on and what we may disagree about, it seems as though we're not unified enough to actually make change. But what I know the course tries to do, and what I think it does, Lucia, of course, you're not going to disagree with me right now on stage. But what I think the course tries to do, and what students have told me it does, is it really does give them an opportunity to think about multiple ways of addressing big, large issues related to oppression, right? So that, there are environmental issues, so that we have eco-feminists who specialize in that. There are issues that pertain particularly to Black people, so we have Black feminists to focus on that. And so one of the things I'll say before I let Lucia get off the hot seat and bring Latra in to talk more specifically about Black feminist theory is that one of the reasons why it's so important for not just me, but my colleagues in feminist and gender studies to take that approach is because we see the work we do to be as complicated, although uniquely, as something like medicine. Everybody in the medical field says that they care about health and wellness, right? But you have different specialists in the medical field that focus on issues that are particular, because you have your general practitioners, but you need somebody that focuses on, reproductive health. You need somebody that focuses on bone health. You need we even have doctors as precise as ear, nose, and throat. So, we have pediatricians that focus on babies and young children. So in feminist theory, I often use that reference to try to explain why we do have a lot of differences, but we do care. All of us care generally about equity and justice and oppression. Thank you so much, Lucia. I'm glad you could be with us. I'm going to bring in Latra to give the people a sense of how Black feminist theorists approach the work, because when we were deciding what we were going to do for today, we decided that we would take one particular framework and dive deeply into it in terms of our analysis. Latra, please introduce yourself to the people and let them know what Black feminist theory is all about.
Hi, everyone. My name is Latra. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a sophomore and a feminist and gender studies major. Today, I'm going to talk about Black feminist theory specifically. Black feminism emerged as a distinct framework within first wave feminism, during which Sojourner Truth, a Black feminist, was at the center of the demand for equal rights for women in America. Black feminism as a distinct framework analyzes and exemplifies that being a woman and powerless are not necessarily coexistent, and also challenge the very idea of what it means to be a woman. Black feminism emerged as a separate social and political movement apart from the Black liberation movement and from the white feminist movement because of the experienced sexism and racism within those respective circles. To be more specific, Black women felt alienated within the white feminist movement because they viewed white women as unable to renounce their white privileges due to their association to white men, and thus they were viewed as not fully committed to true equality. As Black feminist Audre Lorde puts it, the mere tolerance of the experience that Black women bring to the table is insufficient in overcoming the oppression that they face. Consequently, Lorde argued that difference must be respected, affirmatively valued, and also elevated as a necessary source of polarities. Black feminism, to be more exact, primarily, but not only, centers race and sex discrimination within their consciousness-raising endeavors and political organizing. Black feminists politically organize against sexism and racism within and outside their own communities. Although there is nuance within the Black feminist movement, there are feminists such as Audre Lorde and Bell Hooks that speak confidently of the Black lesbian experience and also the lesbian sexuality as one of their main sources of power. Last but not least, according to Black feminist Patricia Hill Collins, Black women experienced oppression in the US through three independent dimensions: economical, which led to their ghettoization into service occupations; political, which denied Black women the rights and privileges usually extended to all white men and many white women; and last but not least, the ideological dimension, through which particular images and representations of Black women were authorized in order to justify and legitimize their treatment and/or oppression. One of the most famous images of this sort is Aunt Jemima on pancake mix boxes.
Thank you so much, Lautra. I really appreciate that. Now, I'll just say, one of the things that you and your classmates have been contending with is the overlap, right? Like you mentioned, you have Black feminist theorists like myself who also resonate deeply with other ways of doing feminist thinking, whether it's radical in the complex ways that Elle pointed out, liberal in ways that we weren't able to discuss here today, but that we've discussed in class. And, to return back to my previous comparison, it's similar to a surgery room, right? Like you have different people in there that play different roles, but there's overlap. Sometimes we come together because our theories and our politics are necessarily or need to be necessarily collaborative. But the distinctness of Black feminist theory is important because of all the reasons you said. And one of the things that has come out of that is a concept that we call intersectionality. And so I'm going to allow you to head on backstage, take a breath, drink some water, and bring in Quattro to talk about intersectionality and how it's become a really significant concept that many of us know now because of social media and all kinds of. I heard intersectionality on a TV show the other day. I thought, woo, we're really in a different time when you hear that term being used so commonly. But Quattro, thank you for coming. Once you introduce yourself, please give the audience an opportunity to better understand the roots of that term, how we use it today, because it's going to be central to the ways that your classmates examine certain scenes in this play here in a few minutes.
Yeah, hello, my name is Quattro. My pronouns are they, them. I am a computer science major and feminist and gender studies minor and a senior at Colorado College. I'm going to introduce the concept of intersectionality. Intersectionality is a legal term that comes from a 1976 court case. Emma de Graffenried sued General Motors, arguing that General Motors' last hired, first fired policy was discriminatory against her as a Black woman, and that because GM only started hiring Black women after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, meaning that Black women were far more likely to be the last hired than any other group, and then would always be the first fired when GM had to cut back on its employees. The court ended up dismissing this case, arguing that de Graffenried had to either pick her oppression as a woman or her oppression as a Black person, and that she couldn't argue that she was uniquely oppressed as both Black and a woman. The court argued that GM wasn't being sex discriminatory because they had hired white women before the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but no Black woman. And it also claimed that if de Graffenried wanted to argue for racial discrimination, she needed to join Mosley et al. Versus GM, which was a court case where it was a group of Black men suing General Motors for racial discrimination. And the term intersectionality came along in 1989 when legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw published a journal article critiquing this ruling of the court. Crenshaw writes, quote, "Black women are sometimes excluded from feminist theory and anti-racist policy discourse because both are predicated on a discrete set of experiences that often do not accurately reflect the integration of both race and gender. These problems of exclusion cannot be solved simply by including Black women within an already established analytical structure. Because the intersectional experience is greater than the sum of racism and sexism, any analysis which does not take intersectionality into account cannot sufficiently address the particular manner in which Black women are subordinated. So Crenshaw is basically arguing that the intersection of racism and sexism that Black women experience needs to be understood as something more than just racism and sexism. It's this unique position that needs to be addressed separately from the movements and policies that focus purely on sexism or purely on racism.
Thank you so much, Quattro. You and I both know that intersectionality has become a term that has been employed in order to examine many people's experiences, even whether we're talking about Indigenous women's experiences, whether we're talking about, Latinos experiences, but you and I and your peers agreed that it was important for the audience here today to know the root of that term, because it is a term that comes out of Black feminist theory. Kimberly Crenshaw was also a critical race feminist scholar as well. And so that we remember the specificity that she was trying to accomplish when she developed this term. The term has taken many turns. I'm learning to accept that and let the term do what it's going to do. And I think it's still important to know that this was a term that was created to address the material implications of oppression that Black women face specifically. So thank you so much for sharing that with me, with the audience, and with your peers. And with that, I'm going to allow you to head off, get some water, take a breath. You did it. And to bring in two of my other students, Manur and Misbah, to help us think about the ways that a Black feminist framework might yield particular interpretations of various scenes in the play, but also to talk about the ways other interpretations might be yielded if one were to examine the play through other frameworks, whether they're feminist or not. So we're going to dialogue. We're going to talk about this. But before we do that, why don't you two introduce yourselves to the people?
I can go first. Hi, I'm Mahanur. I go by she, her pronouns. I'm a sophomore student at Colorado College. I'm a feminist and gender studies major, and I'm hoping to minor in dance. And I'm going to have Misbah introduce themselves.
Hi, y'all. I'm Misbah, pronouns they, them, and I am also a sophomore studying feminist and gender studies as a major, but a hopeful molecular biology double major. And yeah, I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, so I'm excited. So Vogue calls this play a satisfying screwball comedy in which Nottage uses stereotypes to expose them, tapping into a current of rueful entirety beneath the surface. One of the things that you two were interested in talking about is a scene in the play that sort of that I think is relevant to that quote. Let's hear it. What are you thinking? Would you see? We all, by the way, audience, we all saw the play together. Me and all my students opening weekend Friday night. So it's been a while, but we've been thinking about it every week, preparing for this moment. So yeah, what are y'all thinking? Set the scene, and then talk about your analysis and how a Black feminist framework might yield a particular interpretation.
Well, I think. Oh, go, Manur.
Okay. So one of the scenes that Ms. and I were looking at was one of the most important scenes, I would say, from the play. In the first half, it was in Gloria's living room that was happening with Vera and her roommates, as well as Peter and Brad in the room at the time. So we had two white male directors. We had Vera, we had Anna, we had Lottie over there, and also Gloria. And there was definitely a lot of power dynamics that were present in that room at that time, looking at from the lenses of different interlocking systems of patriarchy and racism and white supremacy, as well as people from different classes being in the same living room, and how they were seeing each other and engaging with each other. So we kind of like, I was thinking about really emphasizing on how Peter was kind of like describing what he thinks of his new film or new project that he's working on, and how he see how Black people should exist in it. And he kind of creates this ideal imagination and constructs this idea of Black identity in front of these Black women who are present in the room.
Right.
And I'm also thinking about the context of the play and when it was set, and the time, and just for right now for us, it must have been like the audacity of this person to talk about Black people and construct identities like that, knowing his position of power and privilege. But at the same time, the way he was doing that, and he thought that he was doing something really good, something that has not been done before, which can also be linked to like a lot of ideas of white saviorism, became quite interesting. But also looking at how his construction of identity was again reproducing the system of racism, in which Black people themselves did not have any say to kind of show how they want to be seen on stage, rather than just be seen through the eyes of this white person, white rich male person, who wants to show the history of Black people, especially in the context of slavery and the history of Black people in the US.
Yeah, and I was gonna say that it's very fun and interesting to know that that was the picture, like that scene was actually the still y'all saw before it even started. This whole shindig. So I thought that that was actually very apt to actually use that scene. But then also there was another conversation happening within this greater conversation about racism, where we actually analyze our Brazilian goddess anime, and how she played a kind of particular role with the conversation of colorism, and how where Lottie and Vera were actually having to, like, in a comedic and thoughtful way, still like thought-provoking way, like still engaging in that conversation about what an ideal Black woman looks like, but then also that ideal of like passing, and like, and again, like this hidden theme with Gloria even seen that we will look into with our second scene. But even with Gloria, and like the hints that were presented in the first half, where she might not be who we think she is either, and not being presented as a white woman completely. And so I think that conversation about colorism also complicates the fact of just how pervasive racism really is, and how internalized racism really performs in our daily lives, but also kind of exemplifies how complex and nuanced Black feminism it really is, and how it addresses conversations of not only just how people experience racism and sexism at the same time, but outside of their own communities, but even within their own communities, and how to have conversations regarding those. And I think this is a good transition point to actually go into our second scene and really
wait.
Okay,
wait,
no.
Can we stay here for a little bit? Because
This is your
okay. I want to hear some more of your thoughts so much. I really, really do. There's so many things I was writing down as you said it. When we're talking about a white saviorism, right? And we're identifying white saviorism as a mechanism of racism. Can one or both of you talk about what white saviorism is, and how a Black feminist framework helps us make sense of it? Because see, okay, we have this scene, right? And this guy, the director of the play, he's like, this is what I want to do. I want a scene where the Black people are looking a certain way, and they're dressed a certain way, and they're acting a certain way. And then you have the actors in the background, and they're kind of like mocking it, right? Because of all the things that you said, right? They see what he doesn't see, which is that this is an example of racist white saviorism, right? But I love that you pointed out that he thinks he's doing a good thing because he is not aware of the significance of white saviorism and its relationship to racism. So I would love it if you two could just talk a little bit more about what is a white savior and why is that moment so critical to the play? Because I mean, knowing what I know about Lynn Nottage, that was on purpose.
Mm-hmm.
So from what I was gathering from that scene regarding white saviorism, and that came to me was this idea, which I think what is white saviorism is that one person, this white person who has so much power and privilege, believes that these other people who he thinks is below in the hierarchy than him needs to be saved by him. That the only way they can modernize or develop or become better,
Civilize.
civilize, is through the ways in which I want them to, and only I am the one who knows how to do it, because I am, in their own words, civilized, and I'm, in their own words, modernized. Um, and that kind of notion kind of becomes part of the practice in which they assume the identities of people and then find ways to interact with them through this hierarchical relationship in which they're trying to save the other person and the communities. Um, and moving into the second part of your question, actually, I would have Misbah talk, because I think Misbah also
Yeah,
has a
Ms.
point to
Buck,
share.
anything to add
Well,
about how we can better understand this white saviorism? What is racist about wanting to help people, right? Because this is what we get in response, right? I'm just trying to help. I'm just trying to help. Say more.
Well, I think the most like I think Manur covered a lot of it, where I think it is like a mechanism to actually ensure that those civilized are actually teaching the non-civilized. And then this whole thing about whether or not like I have the knowledge, so I will disseminate it. But then if we go back into history, we realize that like this could have all been avoided if a couple things didn't happen, and it was for a purpose of power. So I think that's something where it's like, if you really want to save somebody, you can also like, that's not the way kind of to do it. It's like enacting that you know more and you obviously know the right things to make this situation better, when really there are multiple ways. And especially like with radical feminism, you're talking about the liberation and like the ending of patriarchy. So that's a completely different framework through which we're talking about saving the uncivilized.
Yeah, and I really appreciate both of your thoughts on that, because I think one thing that Black feminism does have in common with other frameworks like transnational feminism, Chicana feminism, indigenous feminism, is that critique of that impulse to want to even save. And I think it asks us, all of us, but especially people who have a tendency, a historical a tradition, if you will, of going to save. Why? Save from what? Save from who? You? And I think one of the things that you mentioned earlier, that I'll reiterate, is that, you know, the play really illustrated the way that that white saviorism also silences, if not completely ignores or excludes, the voices of the people who supposedly need to be saved, because of what you said, right? When we situate and we, I'm saying we, the proverbial we, when we situate ourselves as the all-knowing, we tend to silence the people we think we need to save, because what do they know? What do they know? And a Black feminist framework is always going to ask, not just white folks, but white folks in cases like this, what makes you think you know better than me, when you, the proverbial you, is the reason I'm here? Thank you so much for that. I want to talk about passing. I'm going to start with you, Misbah, because you talked about passing, you talked about colorism, and I'm hoping that you can give the audience a sense of what we mean when we talk about passing. What is passing? What is colorism? And I know a lot of that will come up in the next scene that you discuss, but if you could just help us understand what those concepts even are intended to examine.
Yeah. So I think passing, and especially I feel like I deal with a lot of conversations around colorism, especially because I am very light skinned as a brown person. And so I think that's the easiest way to describe it, is that some people are lighter and some people are darker. And there are certain privileges that are afforded when you are a lighter tone than you are a darker tone. And those privileges can really help in some ways to gain your specific social mobility, but then it really is also making sure that the system of racism is still intact, because the lighter you are, the more like up in society you can get. And that's what essentially also racism promotes, in a way where if you are white, you get power, you get privilege, you are better, yay, good for you. And then if you aren't, well, you are the uncivilized. So I think that's kind of the conversation about where passing really happens, is when you are light-skinned enough, or just like you can pass as white and you can gain those social mobility ladders, or like you can go up in society essentially, because and you can act a different life than you would be afforded if you performed in a way that is not white. I think is a good definition, I hope. But
no, thank you for getting us going. Thank you for that. Manor, do you have anything you want to add to the ways that we can help people understand colorism passing?
Ms. Ba covered it all, but I just wanna reiterate, like, even in that scene, because before we move to the second scene, even in that scene, the living room scene, colorism was so prominent, and how much privilege being a light-skinned person can get you in spaces like this, and also within communities, a lot of disagreements, a lot of conflicts exist because of colorism that might go unnoticed, and is something that is emphasized within women of color feminism as well as black feminism. And just to keep that in mind while we're theorizing and creating our politics is super important. And I'm going to have Ms. Va take over from here.
Before that, though, and just to reiterate, right, we are always pushing ourselves to think about these things in an intersectional way, right, where we're thinking about race, but we're also thinking about class, we're thinking about gender, we're thinking about sexuality, because of the ways that all of those ways of being are impact the ways that we're subjugated and oppressed, right? So, when you talked about the access to social spaces, political spaces, other kinds of spaces that whiteness affords, and the ways that lighter skin tends to situate one as being able to get closer due to their proximity to whiteness. I was also thinking about the ways that so much of that is mitigated by other aspects of our being, right? So, and you wouldn't have said this, and you didn't necessarily, but I, and in this dialogue, want to point out, right, that one may be really, really light skinned, and one may also be queer, and poor, and what I mean, not have the kind of authorized academic credentials that affords them access to spaces like this, where they get to be on a stage and they get to tell people what is and what ain't and what's what. And we're getting closer to that panel, but I really appreciate the way that you all talked about that, and wouldn't even add, but just would also say that when we're thinking about colorism, as we're about to really in a minute, we want to also be thinking about other ways of being that dovetail with one's skin color in order to create a set of experiences and help us understand the way oppression works. And I think that other frameworks that aren't, even if one doesn't understand a Black feminist framework enough to take it into a play and examine it, which one could argue many of you didn't. I mean, you're students who are learning, right? So, hey, but if one is to interpret a scene like that, the one where the director was setting the scene for his play and the actors were mocking him because of his commitment to a particular kind of white saviorism, without being attentive to race in particular, I'm not sure what kind of interpretation could come out of that scene. I think the scene sort of forces that, not forces it, but I think the scene sort of necessitates attention to race throughout the play. But I think what we get when we think about it through a Black feminist framework is also an understanding of not just class but labor, right? Not even most, except for oh my goodness, I'm forgetting the name. Here it is. Except for Anna Mae. Except for Anna Mae, who's in the room because she is passing for Brazilian and on a date with the director. Every Black person in that room is a worker. Not only that, every Black person in the room works for white people. And so there's a way in which existing in that space facilitates the white saviorism even more, because there's a way in which that, Black laborers, especially Black people who labor for white people, are already expected to be quiet and mute and silent, let alone about their own experiences. And so I really appreciate you bringing that up. And just want to say, yes, anime is passing for a Brazilian, because there's a way in which the play is commenting on the ways that white people sometimes tend to exotify Black and brown people in a particular way, but only to an extent, right? Like only to an extent. And so passing is complicated. It's beyond the scope of our conversation here. But I think I appreciate you bringing it up, because I think that's something people interested in the play and the matters that it tries to address can explore further, right? The complexities of passing. One doesn't just pass because they hate being Black. One passes for the reasons that you said, Misbah, right? They're trying to get access, because not having access sucks, to use some non-academic language, right? It just sucks not to be able to have social mobility, access to a particular class status. I want to talk about this scene. I can't wait to hear what y'all think about this scene. The next scene, we're going to talk about the panel. So the play does all this work to give us a direct view into Vera's life and everybody's life in that moment. And then we fast forward. And then we get to reflect on it, but through this panel discussion. Set the scene. What's going on in the panel, and what were your thoughts about the panel?
As somebody who has been in these and witnessed so many panels, especially as a liberal arts college student, this was a very liberal artsy setup. Really, it was a film media critic type person who was just interested in academically outside words leading this panel, and then there's a feminist feminist and gender studies honestly type academic.
Seriously, I think that was the job.
Yeah, that was it. So it was so funny when all of our class was in that place, and then a poet, and examining the three different ways that they would interpret what happened to Vera Stark, and especially through this Tonight Show style interview that she did, which was her last, I believe. Yes, it was her last interview that she did. And in it, she discovers and shows us a lot of what ended up happening, and we kind of discover as the audiences as well what's happening to Vera. But also there's a lot of interesting critiques that can not critiques but interesting observations you can make through all of the three panelists and actually how they're interacting with each other. So I think and our conversations about colorism can also be in conversant on there, and we can also talk about what ends up really happening through a Black feminist lens through there. And I'm gonna kind of give Manur the floor for a minute. Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Misbah. So yeah, this scene is super important, as Misbah talked about it, and I think one thing that the one thing that the play offers us is a comparison of how life looked like for Vera before getting famous and then after getting famous, and how it kind of changes a lot of ways in which we look at her. Especially, I want to start by talking about class struggle, which is something that has been present, like Professor Lewis just mentioned. How in the first scene that we talked about, both of the Black women were workers, and now Vera has become this huge star and has gotten some sort of class mobility and gotten some sort of privilege that has changed how she is looking at her life, and how she is looking at the systems and the people around her, as well as how she is being, just existing becomes very different when you have accessibility to these resources, and when you have accessibility within this film and media industry that was being talked about. I think the panel was super important as well, while looking at the class struggle that has been happening, and also just I think another thing that we can see in comparison was how in the first scene the director was imagining and constructing this a Black identity in his film, and now the panels are kind of also analyzing the Black woman identity of Vera and emphasizing on that more than the fact that she is a film star. And it's just emphasizing that part of our identity the most, I think becomes like super important, and it's something that we can just sit with and just think about for a while.
Black woman as subject of analysis of a film. What does that mean? So it sounds like, in thinking about the film and being influenced by Black feminist framework, that you all were thinking about the dynamics on the stage during the panel and the ways that, colorism may have had some implications for the dynamics of that conversation. And when we first started talking about this, I think I said it in class, or I might have said it to my daughter who was with us at the play. I wonder if there are in the play casting instruction. Okay, so it was to y'all. Okay, yeah, casting instructions about that in order to make that central, right? We may never know, but regardless, their decisions to cast Marissa, who's very light-skinned, so light-skinned that she could play the woman passing, as the poet activist who's on stage. I think, she could have played Lottie. And then there's the, Dana Skurlock, who played Lottie, is cast as the Black feminist scholar, the feminist and women's studies scholar, who is cast in the role, in that particular role. And then there's the film studies scholar. So what did you all make of the Andre Revels, who played Leroy, and Herb is his name, the film guy, right? What did you make? I want to talk about colorism, but I also want to talk about gender dynamics at play. What are some of your thoughts about that panel and how the conversation went down?
I think throughout, from what I remember, he was unrelenting about his point. He literally was like, but look at how this and this. Here's another piece of evidence that proves my point. And then while like both of the femme identifying people were just like, no, there's so many other ways you can look at this, because it is really like, it was like we don't know. We really don't know. There could be multiple things. And then he like made this whole panel just to make sure that he could actually analyze somebody. And like, I think that was the whole thing where it's like, where gender for me at least comes in play, is like, you really wanted to do this. Like, I think it was like the not the audaciousness, but like it is like feeling like you can do this. And I think that's something that I don't, especially in a lot of women of color spaces specifically, when they're approached with all of this, like we're made to feel like we don't have to be like, we're not sure, we're wrong, we're this, that, and the other. Like we should be unsure about our stuff. But then he was just like, no, this is this.
He was certain.
He was very certain. Yes, that is the word. But I think that is.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No. I was really finishing my thought. That is like where I saw gender the most implemented in the situation. And
Another thing, like just talking about focusing on gender for now, I was also just looking at the female relationships within the whole play, not just this scene, and how they kind of like, I don't know if I want to say it's like a process of like gender empowerment or just like gender relations in general, but it just brings me back to the discussion that we had in class about Black feminism and acceptance of differences within Black feminism as like one of the core focuses, especially when we talk about sexuality and we talk about choices, and I think that is also super important while looking at the panel, and how the feminist and the how they're like just engaging and interacting with each other and talking about Vera. In general, I think that is also important while looking at gender and how a Black feminist is looking at Vera while as compared to other people, and how kind of like gender relations, and even like within Black feminism, how that plays into it, and like looking at and analyzing her.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, and you know me, I mean, I'd need to see the play 5 more times before I could have like a concrete, interpretation or analysis. But as it stands, having only seen it once and just spending a lot of time talking to you all and my daughter about it, it is curious to me that Lynn Nottage constructed the women's studies or feminist scholar in the way that she did, because I think, you're right, Misbah, that she was probably the least forceful with her interpretations, although she wasn't completely meek and silent, right? There were moments where she was being interrupted that you could see her go, and there were moments where she would, no, this is what I think. But, to be, as exactly that, in the world, and having been, constructed as the one who's always dominating, who's always forcing their opinion down somebody's throat, it was very, it was, dare I say, nice to see, Lynn Nottage construct that scholar in a more complex way than what we're typically used to seeing when we think about what a feminist scholar or a women's studies scholar is, right? If we care about feminism or gender, we're usually the one jumping up and screaming and yelling, which I have done and will do again, and it's fine. And but at the same time, the Afua was very much, if not as forceful as her, close. What do you think that's about?
I have a few ways of interpreting it, because the thing is that the women's studies scholar was still like, they put their book on the table and was like,
sure did.
All about it. You can read all about it if you wish. And she ended up having some good guesses about what actually happened to Vera. If we kind of talk about like the guesses and the hints that were being thrown throughout the play, she had a pretty good, like, who knows? Like, maybe she did meet Vera, but yeah,
exactly.
But I think there's like a few ways, like you can talk about it like through the lens that we're talking about with colorism. We can also talk about how creatives are really seen in spaces about liberal arts. But yeah, I just wanted to offer that as like, she did say what she wanted to, and she said, go buy my book.
She so I wanted that's all that needs to be said. How about that? Wait. Speaking of, no, has nothing to do with this conversation, but let me get my shit out. No.
Available now.
Available now, all platforms. But no, I love that. I sat next to you, Miss, but we were hollering when that happened. It was amazing. Manor, what do you think? What may be some other ways we can think about that panel if we're interested in thinking about the dynamics of the conversation? Gender, colorism, positionality in terms of profession. Love that you brought that up. Anything else we might invite people to think about in terms of like different angles you could think about that panel through?
I think we covered a lot of it, but then again, I think one thing that is super important that Misbah also mentioned is like, you can see the difference of like creators in academia, and that's like pretty like prominent when we analyze anyone or anything. And it can be like, we can have like an ethical debate about it, like who gets to say more and who doesn't, and in what ways we are analyzing Vera, or just like this whole discussion between the panel. But I think that is super important and something that is we need to keep in mind while having conversations or just looking at panels in general, that the profession that they come from is super important in kind of creating what kind of discussions they want to talk about. It would be weird if like the poet starts frameworking and creating a framework of Black feminism, and I think that is like, and that happens. And we see that happening in like panels, especially coming to a liberal arts school, as Misbah mentioned before, like people be talking about frameworks of feminism while not have read one book of feminism. So I think just keeping that in mind while moving into panels that we go to, or just even looking at display, becomes like super important.
Yes. So as we wrap this up, I want to say, when we thought about the different ways that we wanted to facilitate a discussion about this play, we talked about so many other things, and there are so many other things that are that are prominent in that play that just were beyond the scope of this conversation. Any conversation with any group of people for an hour is only going to be able to do so much, right? But just to put this on the minds of the audience, people watching now, people who may be watching this later, it will be available. One of the things I would encourage people to think about is the reactions, the audible reactions. We had some conversation in class about how some of us did struggle. I'm just going to say that some of us struggled with the ways that our predominantly white older audience reacted to some things. And, there were moments where, some of us were thinking like, wait, this is funny, but when I hear this behind me, it makes me question whether or not I should even laugh. Like, do they get it? Do they get it? I mean, just to bring up, old problematic Dave Chappelle. I mean, one of the reasons why he left the Chappelle show was, what did he say? I didn't know if they were, at that point in the show, I didn't know if they were laughing with me or at me. And that's something that is really particular to being Black and on stage, because of the ways that we've historically been situated as the butt of the joke. And so, I think we all would just encourage those of you who either have seen the play or will see the play to think about that, to think critically about the ways that we react. We can enjoy it, we can, feel it in the moment, but if you're going to be thoughtful about this play, given this playwright and what she tends to be concerned about, thinking about how we respond and how we engage is really important. We didn't talk about Gloria much. We could have spent an hour talking about the relationship between Gloria and Vera. So it's just to say, not that those things weren't on our minds, but that it's just beyond the scope. And all we wanted to do was come here today and give you all an opportunity to think about what feminism has been, is, and how it has influenced so many of the ways that people like us, especially us three on the stage right now, do the work of interpretation. That being said, I think we've said all that we can say for today. I'm sure we three could talk about this for hours, but we're not, because they have homework to do and they have a magazine to create, and it better be good. So thank you all for coming. We really appreciate you. If you have further questions, comments, and concerns, I'm on all the stuff. You can send questions and comments to my colleagues who will get them to me, and I'll do the best I can to engage. Have a good night, everybody.